Good morning, everybody. I hope you're suitably refreshed and networked after the coffee break. I've been asked to talk about my own personal experience and the experience of my family in seeking a diagnosis of autism for my son Nick. And now I'm really acutely aware of the statistic that was given earlier on about fathers of autistic children. So now I don't know whether I'm part of the 47% or the 53%. What I would ask you all to do is to resist the temptation to diagnose me during my presentation. That would be, if you would do that, I'd be very grateful. So I'm talking mostly from a personal capacity, but John has referred to the work that I do professionally. CFPS is a charity based in Westminster. We're very interested in accountability and transparency of public services, and that was very relevant and interesting to be doing that job during the time of the events that I'm going to talk about, and I'll tell you why. The centre is currently doing some work around safeguarding, principally in response to the events that have taken place in some council areas around child sexual exploitation. Talking about my professional work is probably a different talk for a different conference, but if you're interested, please do look us up. So, the other thing I should say is that although I've told you that I live in Leeds, and that gives you some geographical context for where our experience took place, I'm deliberately not going to mention any organisations. I'm not going to mention any individuals. I just don't think it's fair to do that. But I will tell you what happened to us and hopefully give some pointers around some interesting developments on safeguarding along the way. So, this is introducing me and my family. Some of you may already be able to realise that this is a historic photograph taken some time ago, particularly people at the front, because you'll be able to tell I've got much more grey hair than I had when this photograph was taken. Everything on the presentation is kind of reflects the time that these events took place, which is now some 4 years ago. So I'm able to speak from a historical perspective. You would have easily been able to find people to come and talk to you about live events that they're experiencing now, but hopefully I'll be able to act as a kind of proxy for some of those difficulties. So here I am with my wife Tessa, my daughter Jenny, and Nick, and this photograph was taken at the time we were experiencing the events I'm going to tell you about. You wouldn't be able to tell from this photograph that we were going through one of the most stressful experiences that we've ever had as a family. You can't see our corgi Sally on that photograph, but you will be introduced to Sally later on, although she's not physically present here today. So we moved to Leeds in 2007. Nick was aged 9. He was just about to start year 5 in primary school. Now, he'd always done things a little bit differently. He'd always looked at the world in a different way. I recognise lots and lots of the signs, the behaviours, the attitudes that he was displaying from the things that Robin and Margaret were saying earlier on. But he began to show significant signs, much more significant signs, and they began to become much more difficult, if you like, in around about year 5, year 6. And we were able to get some support for him from his school, Senko. That lasted for a while until the head teacher decided that Nick was taking up too much time and resource from the Senko, and that support was stopped. And so we found ourselves in a bit of a difficult situation with that school. Because we were in rented accommodation at the time, we actually moved to another part of Leeds, and Nick began year 6 in a different school, and that's when things really began to go wrong. And particularly when we began to think that Nick might possibly be autistic, and we began to suggest that that was a problem that we were experiencing and that we needed some help for it. Mostly what I'm going to be talking about is the interaction between education, NHS, and social care. Now, that triangular relationship should be a really strong safety net for supporting parents and families and children, and indeed adults. But sometimes it feels more like a Bermuda Triangle that you can fall into. And we were lucky to come out of that triangle, but some families aren't so lucky. So I mentioned that Nick had some difficulties. Here's some things that he found hard, and I just want to highlight 3 of them because these were the three very key things that we've had significant difficulties with in the process. So he found it very hard to leave his parents because he didn't feel safe. He didn't feel safe or able to have somebody with him to explain what was going on in the world around him. He struggled to leave the house. And in fact, one day he said to my wife and I that he was worried he would grow up to be the only man in Britain who couldn't leave his house. And the third one, which was to prove very significantly tricky, was that he really struggled to go to appointments, particularly at hospitals or with professionals. Hard enough to get him to go to get his hair cut or to the dentist, but to get him to go and talk to people that he didn't know about his thoughts and feelings was very, very difficult. And sometimes it all got too much for him. So here's some photographs of what Nick would do when he found it all too much. He would barricade himself behind cushions. There's a picture of our first dog wondering why Nick's all wrapped up in his sleeping bag, slithering around the floor like a snail. There's a picture of him hiding under his bed. And in the bottom right, a picture of him distressed on the way to an appointment. Now, these are really difficult photographs to have to take. They're really difficult photographs to have to show. Nick's happy that we do show these. But what was interesting about these was we were advised by one professional to take photographs as a way of demonstrating to other professionals the difficulties that we were having in getting Nick to turn up to things. Actually, what happened was we were significantly criticised for taking photographs, and we were asked why we thought any reasonable parent would want to take photographs of their child in distress. This was part of the issue that we faced. But just because Nick was finding things hard didn't mean that he didn't have some significant dreams and aspirations for the future. Although he was worried about what the future might be, he had lots of ideas. And some of the ideas represent his interests, so particularly around medieval weapons and sword fighting. An interesting one that he's very fascinated by meat. So he likes going into butchers to look at meat. So actually he wants to be, at that time, he wanted to become either a famous chef or a famous butcher. And he wanted to be an Olympic athlete. Bizarrely, he thought that involved having lots of injections, but that's probably because he picked up on some doping scandal or other. But the bottom one's really fantastic. He wanted to have lots of friends and not always to be so nervous. So we set out on the course of action to try and get him a diagnosis. So Nick's anxiety was the way that his autism expressed I guess itself most. And his anxiety with school and leaving the house actually led him to become a school refuser. He actually spent 2 years out of school. And along the way, that was interpreted as us wanting to home educate Nick, for us not wanting him to go to school and socialise with other children. Actually, the opposite is true. We've never wanted to home educate Nick. We've never tried to. We desperately wanted him to be in school and socialising with his peers. And we were eventually grateful that a lady running a home hospital school service kind of took Nick on, and he did at least get some basic education during the 2 years that we were going through this process. Now, when we tried to get an initial CAMS assessment, we weren't supported by the school, and I think the school found it really, really difficult to accept that Nick could mask his anxiety at school and then fall apart at home. I think they really couldn't understand that, but it was a key point that came out, I think, from Margaret's presentation earlier. They couldn't. They kind of interpreted Nick at school as waving, not drowning, when in fact he was drowning, not waving. So our initial experience of a CAMS assessment was one that was, I think, very simplistic and actually revolved mostly around talking to us as parents and not actually having much interaction with Nick. And I think the reason for that will become clear later on. So, and lots of things were happening around this time. So my challenge is to give you enough information to make you interested, but not get into too much detail. So we were after a diagnosis for Nick. We were also after some help for him at school through a special educational needs assessment. Now, I know the process has changed now. There are education, health and care plans that replace statements of special educational needs. Again, this wasn't supported by school, and I guess my key learning point for parents is that if you can't get the school on board, boy, it's a hard struggle to get any support. And I noticed that Margaret stressed at least 2 or 3 times that what schools say is really, really important to other professionals. Well, that's great if school understand the issues, but if they're misinterpreting the issues, perhaps they're holding more weight in the process than might necessarily be helpful. Now, the key thing for us, and I'm really pleased that it came out in one of the points earlier on, was that we were accused of fabricating and inducing Nick's signs and symptoms, if you like. And I was pleased to see that Margaret had referred to FII in her presentation. I think we kind of skipped over it a little bit quickly. That was probably because she had a lot to say, and there were lots of points to make. But we discovered that what professionals were really thinking about us, and although we didn't actually see a letter from a paediatrician to social services until much later, after it had been written, it became clear to us that the way people were dealing with us was driven by a belief that we as parents were the problem. And I think there's a real issue with the whole concept and application of fabricated and induced illness. Margaret referred to the fact that it used to be called Munchausen's by proxy. I think that's been a little bit of subtle rebadging by some professionals. The concept, I think, was largely discredited through some very high-profile court cases many years ago. But the key issue for me is that we were told, and in fact it's written down in a letter, that it was impossible for Nick to be autistic. That's quite a strong statement. We've never been able to have access to any notes or the thinking of the professional that wrote that. So my issue is partly with the guidance that sits around FII, and my issue is that if you read it, and I don't know how many people have read it here, almost any of you could be accused of this at any time for exhibiting any type of behaviour. So if you respond in a kind of measured, less emotional way, that's a sign of fabricated and induced illness. If you react in a very emotional, oversensitive way, that's a sign of fabricated and induced illness. So I have some issues with the guidance itself, but I think it was particularly poorly applied in our case, and I've never been able to get access to the to the thinking or the reasoning that professionals went through in terms of setting up that impression of us. Now, the reason why I said my work life was interesting is that I was actually writing some national guidance about how to hold safeguarding arrangements to account at that time. So, fascinating place to be, having this is my personal family experience and having to write those notes and guidance. So the result of our first kind of interaction with Nick's assessment was that Nick wasn't autistic, that he did display separation anxiety, but the problems that Nick had weren't his. Essentially, they were ours. They were his parents, and we were putting onto him anxiety, and we were emotionally abusing him by suggesting that he was autistic. We were putting autistic thoughts and feelings into his head by simply saying, we've got a child who's in some difficulty and we need some help. And although we thought we were getting help in the system, actually we discovered we were being investigated. And between education, social care, and health, we were really struggling. Now, Nick's separation anxiety was always talked about in terms of separation from his mum. And it didn't seem to matter how many times I said, actually, I take Nick to things, and he finds it really, really hard to separate from me as well. This was never written up as, this is something that Nick displays with mum and dad. It was always about his mum, and I think there's something significant there in the way that the guidance was being interpreted. Now, we were very fortunate in a way to be introduced to a clinical psychologist, consultant clinical psychologist who worked in a different part of the NHS in a different part of the country. And they very kindly went out of their way to come and meet us as a family. They came to meet Nick. And actually they were very clear in making a diagnosis for Nick of Asperger's syndrome, of being on the spectrum. This is a very respected person. And we were delighted to receive this kind of endorsement for what we were thinking and feeling. But guess what? We discovered that diagnoses from out of area are not respected by local clinicians. So Nick was not autistic. And we were accused of fabricated and induced illness. So this got the attention of Children's Services, and they got involved. But I think the independent diagnosis that we'd had, which wasn't a private diagnosis, we didn't pay for it, made it really awkward, I think, then for professionals to continue to pursue the line that it was problems with parents. And so we didn't actually find ourselves in any child protection conferences, but we found ourselves in some very confusing meetings with a load of people who we had never seen, who had never met Nick or talked to Nick, some of whom actually wouldn't introduce themselves to us as parents in meetings. So you've got these scary individuals who you know hold a lot of power and influence over what happens to you, but you know they don't interact with you in normal ways. Eventually, that process led to a conclusion that Nick needed to have a second diagnostic process locally, and that led to him having interaction with a new CAMS team, a different team. Ironically, the team that we had originally tried to get him to see 2 years before, and a special educational needs reassessment. So gradually the coin started to flip over from the enforcement side of the system to the support side of the system. So he got his second diagnosis. What was slightly different about this process was that instead of us going into a room, being faced by 3 professionals and about half a dozen more behind a scary 2-way mirror, this team actually came out to the house, and they spent time with us. They saw us in our normal environment, because I tell you what, you're not at ease in a situation where you know people are looking at you through a 2-way mirror. Much more likely to get useful information and feedback when you actually come out to see people. And this second process led to a very clear endorsement of the independent diagnosis that we'd had. They had absolutely no doubts that Nick displayed all the signs of Asperger's syndrome. And that second diagnosis made locally, which we'd waited at least 2 years for, was very significantly opened the floodgates to. It was like a key to a lock. Suddenly all the protection stuff went away, all the enforcement stuff went away, and Nick crucially got support from the support side of the system. He was able to get a statement of special needs. We had a little bit of a hiccup there. We were asking for a statement that covered specialist provision because Nick really, really struggled in mainstream. We initially got a statement for mainstream that had to be tweaked. But ultimately, my question at the end of the process was, what on earth had changed? None of the facts had changed. None of the things we were saying had changed at all. We'd been entirely consistent throughout that 2-year process. It would have been perfectly possible I think, for services to have supported Nick right at the beginning. Instead of diverting attention away from Nick and onto us. I was just saying to Mitzi before I came to speak, Nick was almost parked on the sidelines while we became the focus and attention of services. This process didn't seem actually to be about supporting him at all, but about investigating us. And ultimately, I don't think anything had changed factually at the end than from the beginning. So I think I'm beginning to run close to time, and I want to leave a bit of space for people that want to ask me questions or raise points. So in conclusion, well, what's been the impact on us? Well, the impact on us was that, we had a child who was unhappy and not in school, and we weren't able to get any help. Now, having a child who's unhappy and not in school is challenging enough with help and support. But we very quickly found ourselves in a place where we were stressed and actually sometimes quite scared that we risked, having our children taken away from us because of the fabricated and induced illness accusation. Most of the time you don't know who's being written to, so letters circulate around professionals. You've got no idea what's in them. You quite often see people's names in letters that you've never met, and you don't know who people are in meetings. I just want to finally, in conclusion, just say that Nick's moved on a tremendous amount because of the support that he's received. Here he is being interviewed after the premiere of a film that he made with the NAS as part of their Young Campaigners group. And here's a picture of Sally. Now, Sally's dressed in school uniform. A bit of homework for you. Go away and Google dog in school uniform. The story about how Nick was reintroduced to wearing his school uniform through putting the uniform on the dog has kind of gone viral. So it's there's plenty on the internet out there about it. My final points are that I think our issues were caused simply by not enough awareness, particularly in education. And I know teachers have got a lot to do. But lack of awareness was really a problem for us, the heart of our problem. If schools can't appreciate what's happening with children in difficulties and help you find support, you really have got a struggle on. I think that the fabricated and induced illness guidance really needs to be reviewed. I would possibly be so bold as to say, actually, I think that guidance is quite dangerous and can be quite dangerous. at the end of the day, is it more likely that a child is autistic, or is it more likely that parents are fabricating and inducing? It's more likely that children are autistic if you look at the statistics, so why not start at to look at the more likely end of the spectrum and not the more unlikely or risky end of the spectrum. And the reason why I think fabricated induced illness needs to be reviewed is because there's a clause in the serious crime bill going through Parliament at the moment which seeks to criminalise emotional abuse or emotional neglect. Now, we were accused of emotionally abusing Nick by seeking a diagnosis of autism. If we'd been doing that and this clause had actually been enacted, we risked being prosecuted, possibly sent to jail. That's a really scary prospect. So I think although I'm not campaigning against that clause, I'm absolutely not campaigning against something that I think children need to be protected from. I think the guidance around how that clause, if it's enacted, actually works out in practice is crucial. So my final point is that I'm sure there are lots of people out there who've experienced a much worse experience than we have. I can only share our own experience. I thought at the time it was extreme and very isolated. Since I've done a little bit of research, I've discovered it's not extreme and it's not isolated. Actually, it's increased. It's quite common for parents to experience these difficulties. So. Do go away and Google Sally the dog. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much for that really insightful account, really, of some of the challenges and difficulties within the system. We're right on 12 o'clock, which is time for our next speaker. I can take one question. Possibly two, but if they're brief, but I do need to stick to time. So if we could just take a question over here on the far side of the room, and then someone here at the front. I'd be grateful if you could keep the questions brief. Thank you.
Yeah, I spoke to Tim in the break, and he said make any additional points. I've got a very important point. A year ago this month, I had a telephone call from Margaret Gardner, who runs False Accusation Support Organisation. And Margaret said, Jan, what's happening? She said, I've never had so many cases in a fortnight. She said, they're all autism, and a lot of them come from Brighton and Hove. So I sat down and I looked at it and what was going on. And they weren't just from Brighton and Hove, they were from 3 other areas as well. And so I mapped it, and I looked on the Google, and I found out that what these cases were coming from were the Education, Health and Care Plan pilot areas. And I said to Margaret, if this is what it's like in the beginning of 2014, we're going to be closing down our organisations in the beginning of 2015 because we're not going to cope when the education, health and social care plans are rolled out nationwide. And that's actually happening at the moment. We at Parents Protecting Children, Margaret at FASO, the people at Parents Against Injustice Network, the people in Monique's organisation, the people in the Ehlers-Danlos organisations are absolutely overwhelmed to breaking point at the moment by the number of cases like Tim's and worse, and they're happening because the education, health and care plans are encouraging people to work together, but that's encouraging a whole lot of people to work outside their area of competence. And so because they don't know what they're doing, they're failing to safety by making accusations of abuse where there is none.
Thanks for that point. Thank you very much. Okay, and one final question just at the front here. If you could put your hand up, please. Thank you.
Hello there. My name is Wade Tibbury, and I'm in a fairly unique position because I put my name and effort into writing this Safeguarding Children with Autism guide, but also alongside that as well, a 25-year career in safeguarding, I also was part of putting together a training package called Incredibly Caring to train professionals on safeguarding children who are at risk of fabricated or induced illness. That training package was launched by a whole range of agencies, but not supported at the time, even though they commissioned it by the Department for Education. I think one of the things that was missing Was that training package being supported? And that's all I want to say. And maybe we could have a chat at the end.
Thank
That
you
might
very
be useful.
much. Thank you very much. And thanks to Tim. Thank you very much.
Thank you.